The worst abandonment doesn't come from somebody leaving us or even from being rejected by your partner. The worst abandonment comes when we leave ourselves. And while it is usually easy to recognize when we are being abandoned by somebody else, we can struggle to recognize when we are abandoning ourselves. And that's because these patterns, these ways of thinking become so ingrained in us that we fail to see them even when they are right in front of us. One of the more common ways that we abandon ourselves is by not listening to our gut, by discounting our intuition. And I'm going to give you just one quick example of this. And I want you to think of times in your life when maybe you've done something similar. So, this was several years ago, and I was actively trying to get out of teaching, but couldn't quite figure out the path. And people in my life made one suggestion to me. And it was a path that I knew on some level wasn't right, that it wasn't a good fit, that it would end up being a dead end. But I listened to them anyways, and I ignored my own intuition. And sure enough, it was a dead end. And in this case, that wasn't a big deal. It wasn't a big loss. But I want you to think about how many times has your gut told you that a situation is not right for you, or maybe even dangerous for you? And how many times have you ignored that because you either trusted other people more than you trusted your gut, or because you wanted something to be true so badly that you were willing to ignore your own internal voice? Another way that we abandon ourselves is by neglecting our own feelings, by telling ourselves that we shouldn't feel that way. Have you ever been in a situation where you are really struggling, and yet there's a part of you that says that you shouldn't feel that way because other people have had it worse, or that you're not allowed to feel those things for whatever reason? Anytime you're doing that, anytime that you are feeling things and yet you're also telling yourself that you shouldn't be feeling those things, that's self-abandonment. Another way that we can abandon ourselves is by always putting others' needs before our own. And it's so easy to get into that people-pleasing sort of space. And the problem with that is that we are looking for that validation. We are looking for proof that we are worthy through other people. We get into this place where we think if we can just do enough for them, be enough for them, that that's going to tell us that we are okay. And it even gets to a point where we will do anything to avoid being abandoned by others. Meanwhile, by doing all of those things that aren't true to ourselves, what we are really doing is turning our backs on ourselves. Now, none of that means that you have to be selfish in order to not abandon yourself. In fact, in a weird way, it's actually selfish to always try to people please, to always put others before you. Because what happens then is you're actually putting your own well-being in their hands, which isn't something that they asked for, and it's also not fair to them. So what it means is that by all means, look out for others, but never neglect to look out for yourself too. Self-abandonment can look like denial or pretending. Think of those times when inside you are struggling, inside you are crying, screaming, raging, and yet you tell everybody around you, and maybe you even tell yourself, I'm fine, everything's okay. And when you do that, when you are constantly putting on that mask for the world, and maybe even for yourself, well, you're turning away from yourself. We also abandon ourselves by not speaking up. Think about those times when you have that feeling that you're walking on eggshells, or when you make the decision not to speak up because you don't want to rock the boat. When you have that voice inside of you, that voice that has something it needs to say. And when you silence that voice before you ever open your mouth, that is you abandoning yourself. Sometimes self-abandonment comes out in constant comparison to others, when we are judging ourselves so harshly and always seeing others in a more favorable light than we do ourselves. It's almost like we reject ourselves before we allow others the opportunity to reject us. Sometimes we abandon ourselves by numbing ourselves to the point where we no longer have to feel anything. And this numbing can come in so many forms, anything from substances to food to shopping to sex. The mechanism here doesn't really matter, but pay attention. Are you constantly turning towards something that will numb you and turning away from yourself? And then a final way that we abandon ourselves is through a lack of boundaries. When we don't have strong boundaries, we allow others in further than they should be, and we allow them more influence over us than they should have. And what happens then is that we lose touch with our inner voice. We lose touch with our values, our core, and we start to listen to them and trust them more than we listen to and trust ourselves. Now, what's so crazy with self abandonment is usually we're doing it when we don't feel like we are enough. And we are so scared of being alone. We are so scared of being left. But what's so wild is that self abandonment leads to loneliness, it leads to this emptiness because we want to know, why don't you see me? But when you're abandoning yourself, you're not allowing others to see you because you're not being authentic. You've stuffed the real you away, and that's the part of you that wants to be seen, that wants to be recognized, that wants to be heard. And so, even while you're interacting with others, you can feel alone. And the solution to that isn't to inviting more people into your life, it's inviting yourself back into your own life. Self abandonment can also lead to anger and resentment as we wonder, why don't you value me? We're putting other people's needs first. We're looking out for everybody else. And yet we feel like we are constantly dismissed. But if we don't see our own worth, if we don't stand up for ourselves, how can we expect anybody else to either? So we started off by saying that the worst abandonment is not when somebody else leaves us, but when we leave ourselves. But the beautiful thing is that while we can never control anybody else's actions, we can make the choice each and every day to show up for ourselves, to listen to ourselves, to honor ourselves. We can make the choice to not abandon us.